The storm
I
arrived
am
without
so
warning that
sorry.
November evening,
Oh my gosh,
black
are you
clouds
okay?
swallowing Manhattan's skyline,
You are
as if
so
nature itself
beautiful.
sensed the violence about to unfold in the
I
Marshall
love you
penthouse.
so
Rain lashed
Oh, this
against
can't be
floor-to-ceiling windows
happening.
while inside, candlelight
I'm
flickered
so
across
sorry.
crystal and
We'll
silver,
appeal. We
creating
will.
shadows that danced like demons across the walls. Clayton Marshall stood at the head of his mahogany dining table, his 6'3" frame rigid with fury, knuckles white around a tumbler of whiskey. Across from him, Brooke Hamilton pressed protective hands against her swollen belly, 8 months of pregnancy making her movements careful, deliberate. The Waterford crystal flew before she could register his arm moving, before her mind could process that her husband had actually thrown it at her. Time fractured like the glass itself when it struck her shoulder and shattered, sending shards cascading across Italian marble, drawing blood that bloomed dark against her cream silk dress. She collapsed to her knees, one hand clutching her stomach where their unborn child stirred in distress, the other fumbling for her phone, Vernon's number already on her trembling lips. The penthouse that had once symbolized everything Brooke Hamilton thought she wanted now felt like a gilded prison, its walls closing in with each passing month of her marriage. 3 years ago, she had been unstoppable, a rising star in Manhattan's competitive marketing world, her campaigns winning awards, her future bright with possibility. She had met Clayton at a charity gala, drawn to his commanding presence, the way he owned every room he entered. He was older by 15 years, established, powerful, the kind of man who made things happen with a single phone call. Their courtship had been a whirlwind of private jets and exclusive restaurants, of promises whispered against Egyptian cotton sheets in five-star hotels. But the woman who had once commanded boardrooms now spent her days navigating the minefield of her husband's moods, her world shrinking to the confines of their penthouse, her voice growing smaller with each criticism he leveled at her appearance, her opinions, her very existence. Clayton Marshall had built his empire on control, and he wielded it like a weapon in every aspect of his life. To the outside world, he was the epitome of success, his pharmaceutical company valued at $3 billion, his face gracing magazine covers, his opinions sought by senators and CEOs alike. But behind the mahogany doors of his corner office and within the walls of his home, he was a different creature entirely. The bourbon that had once been a social lubricant had become his constant companion, each glass darkening his mood, sharpening his tongue into something cruel and cutting. He monitored Brooke's credit card statements, questioning every purchase, demanding receipts for coffee, for prenatal vitamins, for the books she read to fill the endless hours alone. Her friends had gradually disappeared, discouraged by his subtle disapproval, by the scenes he would create if she came home even minutes late from lunch. Her family saw her only on holidays, and even then, Clayton's presence loomed large, his hand possessive on her lower back, his smile never reaching his eyes. Vernon Hamilton had spent his entire adult life saving lives in the trauma bay of Metropolitan General Hospital, but he couldn't shake the feeling that he had failed to save the one that mattered most. His younger sister had always been his shadow growing up, following him through their childhood home in Connecticut, demanding he read her stories, teach her to ride a bike, protect her from thunderstorms. He had been there for her first heartbreak, her college graduation, her first job triumph. But when Clayton Marshall entered her life, Vernon had watched helplessly as his vibrant sister dimmed like a light slowly being turned down. The warning signs had been there from the beginning. The way Clayton monopolized her time, the excuses she made for missing family dinners, the nervous laugh that replaced her genuine one. Vernon had tried to voice his concerns once, gently, over coffee. But Brooke had grown defensive, insisting Clayton was just protective, that he loved her too much to share her. Now, as his phone lit up with her call that stormy evening, her voice barely a whisper through tears and pain, Vernon knew his fears had become reality. The transformation from calm dinner to explosive violence had taken less than 5 minutes, but its roots stretched back through weeks of mounting pressure and failed negotiations. Clayton had returned from his office that evening, already several drinks deep, his latest acquisition deal hemorrhaging money, board members questioning his judgment, stock prices tumbling. In his twisted logic, every professional failure somehow traced back to Brooke, to the distraction of her pregnancy, to the money spent preparing a nursery, to the very fact of her existence in his carefully controlled world. She had made the mistake of suggesting they eat in the dining room rather than his study, had dared to mention that perhaps they should consider couples therapy after the baby arrived, wanting to be better parents than either of them had experienced. The word therapy had detonated something primal in Clayton, his face contorting with rage as he accused her of trying to humiliate him, to suggest he was weak, damaged, less than perfect. The verbal assault had started with familiar patterns, his voice rising as he dissected every perceived flaw in her character, her appearance, her intelligence. Brooke had learned to weather these storms in silence, to make herself small, to wait for the alcohol to pull him towards sleep. But tonight was different, charged with a violence that crackled through the air like electricity. When she had tried to leave the room, to protect the baby from the stress hormones flooding her system, Clayton had grabbed her wrist hard enough to leave marks, spinning her around to face him. She had seen her death in his eyes then, a cold calculation that made her blood freeze. The glass had been in his hand, then it was flying through the air, then it was breaking against her body, each shard a small explosion of pain. As she fell, her only thought was for the life inside her, for the daughter she had seen on ultrasounds, for the future that suddenly seemed to be slipping away in streams of blood. The drive from Metropolitan General to the Upper East Side usually took Vernon 25 minutes, but he made it in 12. His surgical training, the only thing keeping his hands steady on the wheel as he ran red lights and wove through traffic. The doorman recognized him, had seen him enough times to know something was wrong from his expression alone, buzzing him up without question. The elevator ride to the penthouse felt eternal, each floor counting up like a countdown to catastrophe. When the doors opened, he could hear Brooke crying, a sound that transported him back to their childhood, to skinned knees and broken hearts he could fix with Band-Aids and ice cream. But this was different. This was the sound of someone breaking apart from the inside. He found her in the dining room, crumpled on the floor like a discarded dress, blood seeping through her fingers where she pressed them against her shoulder. Clayton stood over her, his expression cycling between rage and something that might have been fear, might have been the first dawning realization of what he had done. Vernon's medical training kicked in even as his brotherly rage threatened to overwhelm him. He knelt beside Brooke, his hands gentle but efficient as he assessed her injuries, counting the cuts, checking for glass embedded in skin, feeling for the baby's movement. Her shoulder was lacerated in 3 places, deep enough to need stitches, and there were smaller cuts on her arms where she had tried to shield herself. But it was the irregularity in her breathing, the way she winced with each contraction of her abdomen, that sent ice through his veins. Clayton's attempts at damage control began immediately, his CEO persona sliding into place like a mask. He insisted it had been an accident, that he had merely gestured too wildly, that Brooke had always been clumsy, especially now with the pregnancy affecting her balance. He tried to prevent Vernon from calling an ambulance, suggesting they could handle this privately, that his personal physician could come to the penthouse, that there was no need to involve outside parties. But Vernon had already seen too much. The pattern of old bruises on Brooke's wrists, the way she flinched when Clayton moved too quickly, the calculation in his brother-in-law's eyes as he weighed options, outcomes, cover stories. While Clayton paced and made phone calls to lawyers, Vernon quietly documented everything, using his phone to photograph the scene, the broken glass still glittering on the floor, the blood spatter pattern that told a story of deliberate violence, not accident. The ambulance arrived with lights, but no sirens, a small mercy Vernon had requested to avoid attracting attention from the building's other residents. The paramedics were professionals he knew from the hospital, their eyes taking in the scene with the same trained assessment he had performed. They worked quickly, efficiently, starting IV lines, monitoring fetal heart rate, their faces carefully neutral even as they exchanged glances that spoke volumes. Brooke was loaded onto the stretcher with practiced care, her hand reaching for Vernon's, her grip weak but desperate. Clayton attempted to follow them into the elevator, playing the concerned husband, but Vernon blocked his path with a look that could have frozen hell itself. The doors closed on Clayton's frustrated face, his mask finally slipping to reveal the monster beneath. The ride to Metropolitan General was a blur of medical jargon and barely controlled panic. The fetal monitor showed irregularities, the baby's heart rate dipping with each contraction that seized Brooke's body. She was going into premature labor, her body responding to trauma by trying to protect the life inside her, even if it meant delivering 2 months early. Vernon held her hand as the ambulance wove through traffic, whispering promises that everything would be okay, that she was safe now, that he wouldn't let anyone hurt her again. But even as he spoke the words, he could see the doubt in her eyes, the exhaustion of someone who had been fighting a losing battle for too long. The emergency department at Metropolitan General operated like a well-oiled machine, years of practice making chaos look like choreography. Dr. Pearl Chambers, the head of obstetrics, was already waiting when they arrived, Vernon having called ahead during the ambulance ride. She was a force of nature in scrubs, her 20 years of experience evident in the way she took control of the situation without raising her voice. One look at the fetal monitor, and she was calling for an operating room, for the NICU team to be on standby, for blood products to be ready. The ultrasound revealed what Vernon had feared, a partial placental abruption, the placenta tearing away from the uterine wall, cutting off the baby's oxygen supply. Every minute counted now, every second a race against death. Brooke was wheeled into surgery within minutes of arrival, her eyes finding Vernon's one last time before the doors closed. He was left in the hallway, still in his street clothes, blood on his hands from where he had held pressure on her wounds. For the first time since receiving her call, he allowed himself to feel the full weight of his rage. His hands shook as he pulled out his phone, scrolling through contacts until he found the number for the detective who had consulted on abuse cases at the hospital. This ended tonight, one way or another. Clayton Marshall might own half of Manhattan, but he didn't own the law, and he certainly didn't own Vernon's sister anymore. The surgery lasted 2 hours that felt like 2 years. Vernon paced the waiting room, fielding calls from family, from Clayton's lawyers who had somehow already mobilized, from reporters who had caught wind of an ambulance at the Marshall building. He told them all nothing, his focus entirely on the doors that might open at any moment, with news that would either save or shatter what remained of his family. When Dr. Chambers finally emerged, still in surgical scrubs, her expression was carefully composed, but not without hope. The baby had been delivered successfully, a girl weighing just 2.3 kilograms. Small, but fighting. She would need time in the NICU, support to breathe, to regulate her temperature, to learn to feed, but she was alive. Brooke had lost significant blood, had required transfusions, but she was stable, asking for her baby, asking for Vernon. The NICU was a world of controlled chaos. Machines beeping, nurses moving between incubators like guardian angels. Baby Hope, as Brooke had already named her, was tiny but perfect, her features a delicate mirror of her mother's, untouched by her father's harsh angles. She was on oxygen, monitors tracking every heartbeat, every breath. But her eyes were open, dark and alert, as if she understood she had entered the world as a warrior. Brooke was wheeled in to see her, tears streaming down her face as she reached through the incubator's port to touch her daughter's impossibly small hand. In that moment, something shifted in her expression, a resolve hardening like steel. She turned to Vernon, her voice stronger than it had been in years. She would testify, she would fight, she would make sure Clayton never touched their daughter. The legal machinery began turning before Brooke was even out of recovery. Detective Sarah Chen arrived with a domestic violence advocate, their questions gentle but thorough, building a case that would need to withstand Clayton's considerable resources. Brooke's testimony came in waves, years of abuse pouring out like poison being drawn from a wound. The financial control, the isolation, the escalating violence that she had hidden behind designer sunglasses and careful makeup. She showed them old photos on her phone, images she had taken of bruises, of broken items, evidence she had gathered without really understanding why, some deep survival instinct telling her she might need proof someday. Each revelation was another nail in the coffin of Clayton's carefully constructed public image. Clayton's family arrived at the hospital like an invading army, his mother Margaret leading the charge in Chanel and self-righteousness. They attempted to minimize the incident, to suggest that Brooke was exaggerating, that pregnancy hormones had made her unstable, that this was a private family matter that didn't require outside intervention. They offered money, veiled threats, promises of the best medical care, if only Brooke would sign papers agreeing not to press charges. But Vernon stood as a wall between them and his sister, his medical credentials and reputation lending weight to his words when he described the severity of her injuries, the danger to the baby, the pattern of abuse he had witnessed. The Marshall family retreated, but not before making it clear this was far from over. Enter Gwen Pierce, a lawyer who had built her reputation taking on powerful men who thought money made them untouchable. She arrived at Brooke's bedside with a presence that filled the room, her silver hair pulled back in a bun that meant business, her eyes sharp behind designer glasses. She had already pulled hospital records, police reports, was building a timeline that painted Clayton not as a successful businessman but as a serial abuser who had finally gone too far. She spoke to Brooke not as a victim but as a survivor, outlining a strategy that would not only see Clayton prosecuted, but would ensure Brooke's and Hope's financial security and physical safety. For the first time in years, Brooke felt like she had an ally who understood the magnitude of what she was facing. Clayton's legal team was everything money could buy. 3 partners from the city's most prestigious firm, a public relations specialist, a private investigator already digging into Brooke's past for anything that could discredit her. They painted a picture of a gold digger who had trapped a successful man with pregnancy, who was now trying to cash in through false accusations. They suggested Vernon had coached his sister, that the injuries were self-inflicted or accidental, that Brooke had a history of mental instability. They couldn't quite prove but implied through carefully worded statements. The media caught wind of the story, and suddenly Brooke's face was on every tabloid, her trauma dissected by people who had never met her, her character assassinated in comment sections and gossip columns. But Gwen Pierce had not built her reputation by backing down from difficult fights. She assembled a team of expert witnesses, domestic violence specialists who could speak to the patterns of abuse, medical professionals who could testify that Brooke's injuries were consistent with assault, not accident, financial forensics experts who documented the systematic economic abuse. She found former employees of Clayton's who had witnessed his temper, ex-girlfriends who had signed NDAs but were willing to testify to patterns of behavior. Each piece of evidence was a thread that, when woven together, created a net from which Clayton couldn't escape. The trial began on a cold February morning, the courthouse steps crowded with reporters and protesters, some supporting Brooke, others convinced by Clayton's PR machine that she was a lying opportunist. Inside the courtroom, the atmosphere was electric with tension. Clayton sat with his lawyers, his expression one of practiced concern, playing the role of a wrongfully accused man. Brooke entered with Vernon and Gwen flanking her, her appearance transformed from the broken woman in the hospital to someone who had found her strength. She had lost weight since the birth, stress carving new angles in her face, but her eyes were clear, determined. The prosecution's case was methodical. Building from the foundation up, they presented the medical evidence first. Photographs of Brooke's injuries blown up on screens. The emergency room doctor testifying to their severity. The glass pattern analysis showed the tumbler had been thrown with force, not dropped or accidentally knocked over. The ultrasound images from that night showed the placental abruption, the risk to the baby's life, the emergency that had required immediate surgery. Each piece of evidence was a brick in the wall the prosecution was building around Clayton, cutting off his avenues of escape. Vernon's testimony was devastating in its clinical precision. As a trauma surgeon, he had seen countless injuries, could read the story written in blood and bruises. He described finding his sister, the pattern of her wounds, the way they could only have been inflicted by someone throwing an object at her with deliberate force. He spoke about the old bruises he had noticed, the pattern of escalation he had witnessed over 3 years. When the defense tried to suggest he was biased, that his testimony was colored by brotherly protection, Vernon responded with the cold facts of medical science, irrefutable in their clarity. His love for his sister was evident, but it was his professional expertise that carved away at Clayton's defense. The defense's strategy was to attack Brooke's credibility, to paint her as unstable, manipulative, driven by greed. They brought up her decreased work productivity before leaving her job, suggesting mental health issues rather than acknowledging the isolation Clayton had imposed. They questioned why she hadn't left earlier if the abuse was real, why she hadn't told anyone, why there were no police reports before that night. Each question was designed to plant doubt, to make the jury wonder if perhaps Clayton was the real victim here, a successful man brought down by a calculating woman. Clayton himself took the stand, his performance worthy of an Oscar, tears appearing at just the right moments as he spoke about his love for his wife, his excitement about the baby, how the glass had slipped from his hand during an animated conversation about baby names. But Brooke's testimony shattered his carefully constructed narrative. She spoke for 3 hours, her voice growing stronger with each word. She detailed the slow erosion of her independence, how Clayton had convinced her to leave her job for the good of their future family, how he had systematically cut her off from friends and family. She spoke about the financial abuse, how he monitored every penny she spent while flaunting his wealth, how he had threatened to leave her with nothing if she ever tried to leave. She described the escalation of violence, from grabbed wrists to shoved shoulders to the night he had thrown the glass. When the defense attorney tried to shake her story during cross-examination, suggesting she was confused, that pregnancy had affected her memory, she responded with dates, times, specific incidents that painted a picture too detailed to be fabrication. The most powerful moment came when Brooke was asked why she had stayed. The courtroom fell silent as she gathered her thoughts, then spoke directly to the jury. She explained the psychology of abuse, how it doesn't start with violence but with love that slowly transforms into control, how each incident is followed by apologies, promises to change, gifts and gestures that make you doubt your own experience, how isolation makes you believe you have nowhere to go, no one who would believe you, how pregnancy had made her more vulnerable but also more determined to protect her child. She spoke about the shame of admitting her perfect marriage was a nightmare, the fear that people would judge her for staying, the terror that Clayton's money and influence meant he would always win. Her words resonated through the courtroom, several jurors wiping away tears. The verdict came after 2 days of deliberation. Clayton stood as the foreman read the decision, his confidence finally cracking as the word guilty echoed through the courtroom. Guilty of assault, guilty of domestic violence, guilty of endangering the life of an unborn child. The judge's sentence was swift and severe. 10 years in prison, no possibility of early parole, a permanent restraining order protecting Brooke and Hope. Clayton's face cycled through disbelief, rage, and finally fear as court officers approached with handcuffs. His mother screamed from the gallery, His lawyers promised appeals, but the damage was done. The empire Clayton Marshall had built on control and fear came crashing down in a moment of justice that felt like the first real breath Brooke had taken in years. The news spread like wildfire through Manhattan's elite circles and beyond. Clayton's company stock plummeted as investors fled, not wanting to be associated with his toxicity. The board voted him out within hours of the verdict, his name removed from buildings, from products, from the carefully cultivated legacy he had spent decades building. Former employees came forward with their own stories of his abuse of power, of a toxic culture that had been hidden behind profit margins. The pharmaceutical empire that had seemed unshakable crumbled within weeks, eventually sold off in pieces to competitors. Clayton Marshall became a cautionary tale, his fall from grace complete and irreversible. For Brooke, the months following the trial were about rebuilding, not just recovering. She moved into a brownstone in Brooklyn, away from the Manhattan social scene that had enabled Clayton's behavior through silence and complicity. Vernon helped her establish routines, finding therapists who specialized in domestic violence recovery, helping her reconnect with old friends who had been pushed away. Hope grew stronger each day in the NICU, finally coming home after 6 weeks, tiny but tenacious. Holding her daughter for the first time outside the hospital, Brooke felt something she hadn't experienced in years: genuine happiness untainted by fear. The Hamilton Foundation was born from pain but built on purpose. Using the divorce settlement that Gwen had secured, Brooke established a nonprofit dedicated to helping domestic violence survivors navigate the legal system, providing not just shelters but lawyers, therapists, financial advisors, and job training. She hired survivors as counselors, understanding that lived experience was invaluable in reaching women who were where she had been. The foundation's first gala, held exactly 1 year after that terrible night, raised $3 million. Brooke spoke to the crowd of donors, many of whom had once attended Clayton's parties, her voice steady as she told her story, turning her trauma into a call for action. Vernon stood beside her through it all, his role evolving from protector to partner in the foundation's mission. He established a protocol at Metropolitan General for identifying and supporting domestic violence victims who came through the emergency department, training staff to see beyond the immediate injuries to the patterns underneath. He testified before the state legislature about the medical costs of domestic violence, pushing for better funding for prevention and intervention programs. The Hamilton siblings became a force for change, their shared trauma transformed into shared purpose. Hope grew up surrounded by love and strength, her early arrival into the world becoming just one part of her story rather than its defining feature. By her first birthday, she had not only caught up to typical developmental milestones but exceeded them, her resilience apparently inherited from her mother. Brooke often watched her daughter sleep, marveling at the peace in her tiny face, grateful that Hope would never know the fear that had marked her earliest moments. The nursery that had been planned in the penthouse was recreated in the Brooklyn brownstone, but this time filled with joy instead of dread, laughter instead of silence. The letters from prison started arriving after 6 months, Clayton's handwriting still commanding even from behind bars. Brooke never opened them, instead handing them directly to her lawyer to file away in case they were needed for future legal proceedings. She heard through the legal grapevine that he had been denied his first appeal, that his fellow inmates had not taken kindly to his crimes, that the man who had once commanded boardrooms now spent his days in a cell smaller than his former closet. She felt no satisfaction in his suffering, only relief that he could no longer reach her or Hope. Dr. Pearl Chambers became an unexpected friend, checking in on Hope long after her medical need had passed, becoming something of a grandmother figure in their rebuilt life. She spoke at foundation events about the medical reality of domestic violence, the long-term health impacts that lasted far beyond visible bruises. Her presence was a reminder that healing happened in community, that the village it took to raise a child could be built from chosen family, from professionals who went beyond their job descriptions, from strangers who became supporters. The Brooklyn brownstone became a haven not just for Brooke and Hope, but for other survivors who needed a safe space to figure out their next steps. Informal support groups gathered in the living room, women sharing their stories over coffee and tears, finding strength in solidarity. Brooke's home, once a prison, became a symbol of freedom, its doors open to those who needed to remember what safety felt like. Hope grew up surrounded by these women, learning from childhood that strength came in many forms, that survival was an act of courage, that her mother was a hero not despite her scars but because of how she had transformed them into purpose. 3 years after the trial, Brooke stood in Central Park on a perfect spring morning, pushing Hope on a swing as Vernon helped his own newborn daughter take her first steps on the grass nearby. The cherry blossoms were in full bloom, pink petals falling like snow, like hope, like promises of new beginnings. Hope's laughter rang out clear and true, the sound of a child who had never known fear. who had been protected by a mother who had found her strength in the darkest moment. Brooke caught her brother's eye across the playground, a moment of silent acknowledgement passing between them. They had survived. More than that, they had thrived. Clayton's mother had attempted one last legal maneuver, seeking grandparental rights to Hope, claiming Brooke was poisoning the child against the Marshall family. The case was dismissed within minutes, the judge citing Clayton's conviction and the restraining order as clear indicators that contact would not be in the child's best interest. It was the final blow to the Marshall family's influence, their money unable to buy what they had always taken for granted: access, power, control. Margaret Marshall left the courthouse in defeat, the dynasty her son had built revealed as the hollow empire it had always been. The foundation's work expanded beyond New York, chapters opening in Chicago, Los Angeles, Atlanta. Brooke traveled to speak at conferences, her story inspiring legislation, funding, and most importantly, other survivors to seek help. She always returned to Brooklyn, to hope, to the life she had built from the ashes of her old one. She dated occasionally, cautiously, Vernon's protective presence, a gentle reminder that she deserved someone who would treasure her strength, not try to diminish it. But her focus remained on hope, on the foundation, on turning her worst nightmare into a beacon of hope for others. On the 5th anniversary of that terrible night, Brooke stood before a packed auditorium at Columbia University, delivering the keynote address for a conference on domestic violence prevention. In the audience sat judges, lawyers, doctors, social workers, and survivors. But her eyes found Hope, now 5 years old, sitting in the front row with Vernon, wearing a dress she had picked out herself. Bright yellow like sunshine, like happiness, like the future Brooke had fought to give her. As she began to speak, her voice carried the weight of experience, but also the lightness of freedom. She told her story one more time, but this time it wasn't about Clayton, about the violence, about the fear. This time it was about the after, about the rebuilding, about the moment when surviving became thriving. The speech concluded with words that would be quoted in textbooks and carved into the foundation's new building. Truth has the power to shatter empires built on fear, but more importantly, it has the power to save lives trapped within them. Every survivor's story is a crack in the wall of silence that enables abuse. Every voice raised is a hand extended to someone still trapped. We do not speak to relive our trauma, but to light the way for others to escape theirs. Hope is not just my daughter's name, it's what we offer each other when we refuse to let violence have the last word. As applause thundered through the auditorium, Brooke walked off the stage to embrace her daughter, lifting Hope into her arms. The child whispered something that made Brooke laugh, a sound of pure joy that seemed impossible from someone who had once cowered in fear. Vernon joined them, his arms encompassing both, creating a circle of protection and love that no force could break. Around them, the audience rose to their feet, not just applauding a speech but celebrating survival, resilience, and the unbreakable bonds that can emerge from the darkest moments. The Marshall penthouse was eventually sold, renovated, its history erased by new owners who knew nothing of the violence that had occurred within its walls. But across the city, across the country, the Hamilton Foundation's shelters stood as monuments to survival, their doors always open, their lights always on. In each one, women found what Brooke had found, that leaving was possible, that healing was achievable, that life after abuse could be not just bearable but beautiful. Hope's laughter, captured in a photograph that hung in every shelter, became a symbol of what was possible when courage met support, when silence was broken, when truth was finally spoken. As the sun set over Brooklyn that evening, Brooke stood at her window watching Hope play in the garden with Vernon's children, their voices carrying on the wind like music. The storm that had arrived that November night 5 years ago had nearly destroyed everything, but from its wreckage had grown something stronger, something beautiful, something unbreakable. She thought of the women in shelters tonight, taking their first steps toward freedom, and whispered a prayer of strength for them. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new women seeking help, new battles to fight. But tonight, there was peace, there was hope, and there was the knowledge that sometimes the most devastating endings could become the most powerful beginnings. The garden where Hope played had been Brooke's first real project after the trial, transforming the small patch of earth behind the brownstone into something magical. She had planted it with her own hands, feeling soil between her fingers for the first time since childhood, each bulb and seed a small act of faith in the future. Vernon had helped her build raised beds, understanding that she needed to create something, to prove that she could nurture life instead of just surviving it. Now tomatoes grew heavy on their vines, sunflowers reached toward the sky like Hope's own growth, and butterfly bushes attracted wings of orange and black that made her daughter squeal with delight. The garden was more than vegetables and flowers. It was proof that beautiful things could grow from broken ground. The foundation's success had attracted attention from unexpected quarters. Senator Rebecca Flynn, herself a survivor who had hidden her history throughout her political career, reached out to Brooke with a proposal that would change everything. She wanted to introduce federal legislation that would provide funding for domestic violence programs nationwide. But she needed a face, a story, someone who could make the abstract real for her colleagues who had never understood why this mattered. Brooke had hesitated at first, the prospect of that level of exposure triggering old fears about public scrutiny. But Hope, playing at her feet with blocks, had looked up at her with those determined eyes, and Brooke knew she couldn't let fear make decisions anymore. The journey to Washington, D.C. marked a new chapter in Brooke's advocacy. She testified before Congress on a humid July morning, the Capitol building's marble halls echoing with footsteps in history. Clayton's conviction had made national news. But this was different. This was Brooke choosing to be visible, to use her voice not in a courtroom defending herself but in the halls of power demanding change. She spoke for 45 minutes without notes, her words painting pictures of not just her own experience but those of the hundreds of women the foundation had helped. She talked about the economic cost of domestic violence, the children left traumatized, the talent lost when brilliant women were forced to abandon careers to survive. When she finished, the chamber was silent for a moment before Senator Flynn stood to applaud, followed slowly by others, even those who had seemed skeptical. The legislation passed 6 months later, allocating $2 billion over 5 years for domestic violence prevention and survivor support. Brooke was invited to the signing ceremony, standing behind President Harrison as he signed the Violence Against Women Reauthorization Act, with strengthened provisions they had fought for. Hope was there too, now 6 years old, wearing a purple dress she had insisted on choosing herself. When the president bent down to shake her hand, Hope announced loudly that her mommy was a superhero who helped other mommies, causing a ripple of laughter through the formal gathering. But Brooke's eyes filled with tears, because from the mouth of her child came the truth she was still learning to believe. The years had taught Brooke that healing wasn't linear. That trauma lived in the body in ways that surprised her even now. There were still nights when thunderstorms made her flinch, when the sound of breaking glass at a restaurant sent her heart racing. She had learned to manage these moments through therapy, through EMDR sessions that helped her brain reprocess the memories, through yoga classes, where she reconnected with a body that had once only known how to brace for impact. Dr. Martinez, her therapist, had become a crucial guide through the landscape of recovery, helping her understand that strength didn't mean never feeling afraid. It meant feeling the fear and choosing to continue anyway. Vernon's role in her life had evolved from protector to partner to something even more precious. The brother she had always had but had been too trapped to fully appreciate. He had started a support group for family members of domestic violence survivors at the hospital, recognizing that the ripple effects of abuse touched everyone who loved the victim. His wife, Jennifer, had become like a sister to Brooke, their children growing up more like siblings than cousins. Sunday dinners at Vernon's house became sacred, a tradition that anchored the week, that reminded them all that family could be a source of strength rather than pain. Hope called it Family Day and would count down the days each week, her excitement infectious. The foundation's work had expanded into prevention programs, working with schools to teach young people about healthy relationships before patterns of abuse could take root. Brooke often spoke at high schools, her audience teenagers who listened with an intensity that surprised their teachers. She talked about red flags, about the difference between love and control, about how abuse never started with violence, but with someone making you feel like you were lucky they chose you. After one such talk, a 17-year-old girl approached her, tears streaming down her face, recognizing her own relationship in Brooke's words. That girl, Madison, would later credit that presentation with saving her life, escaping a relationship that had all the warning signs of escalating violence. Clayton's presence in their lives had been reduced to legal documents and occasional news that filtered through lawyers. He had been transferred to a maximum security facility after an altercation with another inmate, his charm and manipulation ineffective in a world where money and connections meant nothing. His mother had died 2 years into his sentence, the stress and shame of her son's fall contributing to a massive heart attack. His father, William Marshall, had attempted to reach out to Brooke once, a letter asking to meet Hope, to know his granddaughter. Brooke had struggled with the decision, consulting with Dr. Martinez, with Vernon, with Gwen. In the end, she had agreed to a single meeting in a public place, with Vernon present, giving Hope the chance to know her history while maintaining strict boundaries. That meeting in Bryant Park had been surreal, watching William Marshall, once so imposing at society gatherings, reduced to a lonely old man feeding pigeons. Hope had been polite but distant, more interested in the carousel than in the grandfather who was a stranger to her. William had brought a trust fund document, an attempt to provide for Hope's education, perhaps seeking redemption through money as the Marshall family always had. Brooke had accepted it on Hope's behalf, but made it clear this granted no ongoing relationship, no claim on their lives. As they left, Hope had asked why the sad man knew her name, and Brooke had explained in simple terms that families were complicated, but the only family that mattered was the one that kept you safe. The romantic part of Brooke's life had remained largely dormant for years, her focus entirely on Hope and the foundation. But then James Chen entered their world, not as a romantic interest, but as an architect hired to design the foundation's new headquarters. He was gentle in a way that didn't diminish his strength, creative without being chaotic, and most importantly, he understood boundaries. Their relationship developed slowly, over coffee meetings about building plans that gradually became coffee meetings about everything else. He had his own story of loss, a wife who had died of cancer, leaving him to raise twin boys alone. Their broken pieces seemed to fit together in a way that created something whole rather than sharp. The first time James met Hope, Brooke watched like a hawk, every protective instinct on high alert. But Hope, usually shy with strangers, had immediately wanted to show him her art project, a collage about families that included pictures of Brooke, Vernon, her cousins, and interestingly, a space labeled maybe someday that she wouldn't explain. James had examined it with genuine interest, asking questions that made Hope beam with pride. Later, as he helped with dinner while Hope did homework at the kitchen table, Brooke felt something she hadn't experienced in so long she almost didn't recognize it, the possibility of a future that included partnership without fear. Their relationship remained measured, careful, both of them carrying responsibilities and histories that demanded respect. James never pushed for more than Brooke was ready to give, understanding that trust, once shattered, had to be rebuilt one small gesture at a time. He attended foundation events as a supporter, not claiming space that wasn't offered. He learned Hope's routines, her favorite books, her fear of loud noises that echoed her mother's, never questioning why a child who had never consciously experienced violence might carry its echo in her bones. When Brooke finally allowed him to stay overnight for the first time, 2 years after they met, it felt like a victory not over fear but alongside it. The foundation's new building, designed by James, stood as a testament to transformation. Where once abandoned warehouses had crumbled, now rose a structure of glass and steel that seemed to capture light and reflect it back doubled. The shelter areas were private, secure, but filled with windows that could be covered if needed, giving residents the choice between openness and safety. The children's areas were painted in colors Hope had helped choose, bright and hopeful without being overwhelming. The counseling rooms were designed with multiple exits, understanding that feeling trapped could trigger panic. Every detail spoke to an understanding of trauma and recovery that went beyond architecture into empathy. The opening ceremony brought together survivors, advocates, politicians, and philanthropists from across the country. Brooke stood at the podium, looking out at a sea of faces that included women she had helped leave abusive situations, teenagers from the prevention programs, volunteers who gave their time to answer crisis hotlines. Vernon stood in the front row with Jennifer and their children, his pride evident. Hope, now 8, sat with James and his boys, the blended family they were carefully becoming. As Brooke began to speak, she thought of that night 10 years ago when glass had shattered against her body, when she had thought her life was ending. She could never have imagined standing here, powerful, free, surrounded by love and purpose. Her speech that day became legendary in advocacy circles, not for its polish, but for its raw honesty. She talked about the myth of the perfect victim, how society expected survivors to be saints who never fought back, never made mistakes, never loved their abusers even as they feared them. She spoke about the complexity of leaving, how it took an average of 7 attempts before successfully escaping an abusive relationship, how judgment from others often drove victims back into danger. She challenged the audience to examine their own complicity, the dinner parties where they had laughed at controlling behavior disguised as jokes, the times they had wondered why she didn't just leave without understanding the web that trapped her. But most importantly, she talked about hope, about the possibility of transformation, about how the worst things that happened to you didn't have to be the things that defined you. The Foundation's programs had evolved to include legal aid, job training, childcare, and even a scholarship program for survivors pursuing higher education. One of their first scholarship recipients, Diana Rodriguez, had gone on to become a lawyer specializing in domestic violence cases, returning to work for the foundation that had saved her. Another, Rachel Thompson, had started her own tech company, employing other survivors and donating a percentage of profits back to the cause. These success stories weren't just statistics in annual reports. They were proof that survival could become thriving, that victims could become victors in the truest sense. Hope's understanding of her story had evolved as she grew older, age-appropriate conversations, building a framework for understanding why she didn't have a father like some of her friends. Brooke had been honest without being graphic, explaining that sometimes adults made choices that hurt others, that her father had been one of those people, and that keeping them safe meant staying away from him. Hope had processed this with the remarkable resilience children possess, more concerned about whether she might inherit his anger than about his absence. Brooke had assured her, with Vernon's medical knowledge backing her up, that violence was a choice, not a gene, that Hope could choose kindness every day of her life. The 10-year anniversary of that violent night approached with a weight Brooke hadn't expected. A decade seemed both impossibly long and startlingly short. Clayton would be eligible for parole soon, though Gwen assured her it was unlikely to be granted given the severity of his crimes and his behavior in prison. Still, the knowledge that he might walk free someday sent ripples of old fear through her body. She had learned to sit with these feelings, to acknowledge them without letting them control her. Fear was a reasonable response to genuine danger. The key was distinguishing between past threats and present reality. A documentary filmmaker, Alexandra Wong, had approached Brooke about telling her story on film, not as a true crime sensationalization, but as an educational tool about domestic violence and recovery. After much consideration and consultation with Hope, who was now old enough to have opinions about her family's story being public, Brooke agreed. The filming process was therapeutic in unexpected ways, allowing her to narrate her own story, to control the narrative that had once been controlled by others. Hope appeared briefly, a decision she made herself, wanting other children of survivors to know they weren't alone, that their mother's courage was something to be proud of, not ashamed of. The documentary's release coincided with the Foundation's 10th anniversary gala, a black tie event that raised $5 million in a single evening. Brooke wore red, a color she had avoided for years because Clayton had insisted on it, reclaiming it now as her choice. Her power. Hope, now 10, gave a speech that brought the room to tears, talking about her mother as her hero, about the Foundation as her extended family, about Hope not just as her name but as her inheritance. When she finished, the standing ovation lasted 5 minutes. But Hope only had eyes for her mother, running off the stage to throw her arms around Brooke's neck. James proposed that night, after the gala, in the quiet of the Foundation's garden that had been Hope's idea to include in the building plans. It wasn't a surprise. They had discussed marriage, had undergone couples counseling to ensure they were building something healthy, something that would last. But the moment was perfect in its simplicity. James on one knee among the roses Hope had helped plant, offering not rescue but partnership, not completion but complement. Brooke said yes, with tears streaming down her face. Yes to love that didn't diminish her independence. Yes to a future that included someone who had proven through years of patience that he understood what trust meant to someone who had survived betrayal. The wedding was small, intimate, held in the Brooklyn Brownstones garden on a perfect September afternoon. Hope was the maid of honor, Vernon the man of honor, their roles in the ceremony reflecting their roles in Brooke's life. James's boys served as groomsmen. The blended family they were becoming evident in the ease between the children. Gwen officiated, having gotten ordained specifically for the occasion, her words about justice and love bringing together the threads of Brooke's journey. When they exchanged vows, Brooks included a promise to continue choosing courage even when fear whispered old warnings, while James promised to honor not just who she was, but who she had been and who she was becoming. The honeymoon was brief, just a weekend away while Vernon and Jennifer watched the children, but it marked something significant. For the first time in over a decade, Brooke truly relaxed, her body releasing tension she hadn't realized she was still carrying. She and James walked on the beach, talking about everything and nothing, making plans for the blended family they were creating, for the Foundation's future, for the life they were building together. When she returned home to find Hope had organized a welcome home party with her stepbrothers, complete with handmade signs and slightly burned cookies, Brooke felt the last piece of her heart heal over, scarred but whole. Clayton's parole hearing came and went without fanfare, denied as Gwen had predicted. He would serve his full sentence, would emerge into a world that had moved on without him, where his name was synonymous not with success but with shame. Brooke received the news with neither celebration nor fear, simply acknowledgement that justice continued to be served. She had stopped thinking of him as Hope's father long ago. He was simply a cautionary tale, a reminder of what she had survived, what she had overcome. Hope knew she could ask questions about him whenever she wanted, but as she grew older, she seemed less interested in the man who had contributed DNA, but nothing else to her existence. The Foundation's influence had spread internationally, with Brooke consulting for organizations in Europe, Asia, and South America. She learned that domestic violence was a universal plague, crossing all boundaries of culture, class, and geography. But she also learned that survivors everywhere shared the same incredible strength, the same capacity for transformation when given support and resources. The Hamilton Foundation model was replicated in 20 countries, each adapted to local needs but maintaining the core principle that survivors deserved not just safety but the chance to thrive. As Hope entered middle school, she showed signs of her mother's strength and her uncle's medical interests, volunteering at the Foundation's child care center, learning to comfort younger children who arrived scared and confused. She had inherited Brooke's empathy and Vernon's steadiness, a combination that made her a natural caregiver. But she also had something neither of them had possessed at her age: unshakable security in who she was and where she came from. When school projects asked about family heroes, she wrote about her mother without hesitation, about her uncle who saved lives, about the village of survivors and advocates who had raised her. The day Hope turned 13, Brooke stood in the same Brooklyn brownstone, looking out at the same garden, but everything had changed. The frightened woman who had arrived here clutching a newborn had transformed into a force of nature, her foundation helping thousands of women each year, her voice influential in national policy, her story a beacon for those still trapped in darkness. James was in the kitchen with their youngest, a daughter they had adopted from the foster system, a child who had needed the same chance Hope had been given. Vernon and his family would arrive soon for the birthday celebration, the house filling with the chaos of children and love. As Brooke watched Hope in the garden, now taller than the sunflowers she had helped plant as a toddler, she thought about the journey that had brought them here. Every scar on her body told a story, but they were not stories of defeat. They were battle wounds from a war she had won, reminders that she had faced the worst, and emerged not just alive but magnificent. The Foundation's motto, engraved in stone at the entrance of every shelter, captured what she had learned. From survival to revival, from victim to victor, from silence to strength. The storm that had begun this story, that November night when glass shattered and blood spilled, had passed. In its wake had grown something beautiful, something unbreakable, something that would outlast any empire built on fear. Brooke Hamilton Marshall Chen had become more than a survivor. She had become a testament to the power of transformation, proof that the human spirit could endure the unendurable and emerge not just intact but incandescent. And as Hope's laughter rang out across the garden, joined by her siblings and cousins, Brooke knew that this was the true victory. Not just that she had survived, but that she had created a world where her daughter would never have to.